So in an earlier video, I talked about how Putin was not willing to go to Istanbul. Maybe that's the best way to say this. And he sent the B team. But who's the B team that he sent in place to negotiate on things that won't really matter and won't bring us to peace? That's what we're going to talk about in this video. So here's President Erdogan, and here's Zelensky and the Ukrainians that you recognize. But who are these guys over here? Well, we'll talk about that. So the Russian President Vladimir Putin, this is from the Foreign Ministry of Russia. Russian President Vladimir Putin signed an instruction appointing the Russian delegation for the talks with Ukraine. The delegation includes Vladimir Medinsky, Mikhail Galuzin, Igor Kostyuskov, and Alexander Fomin. Let's talk about each of those and try to understand who they are, because their backgrounds may be very important to understanding what's going on and as they're going to be negotiating. Are they going to have any real authority to negotiate? Probably not. They're not going to be, they're sent with a very specific, narrow focus of making their demands. And that'll make sense because of who they were back in 2022 when they made their previous demands. So let's look at this. Now, Mark Galati, he writes a lot about Russia and Ukraine and the area. Putin was never likely to attend, not least as he wasn't going to allow it to look as if he had been manipulated and dared by Zelensky. So, we're not going to respond to an ultimatum is a kind of thinking here, or well, I can't look like he made me go. Okay, Ben Hodges replied, but that's exactly what happened. Putin was manipulated by the smarter, more courageous Zelensky. Nice try putting lipstick on a pig. Now, I think Galati has a lot of insight. In fact, let's look at his whole thread. It's easy and not wholly untrue to slam Vladimir Medinsky leading the Russian delegation to Istanbul as nobody, but perversely, although I think monstrously unlikely anything meaningful will come from the talks, the composition of the delegation is encouraging. I don't know how it's encouraging, but okay, let's just continue to read. He goes up 1 point. That's the bottom line up front. Putin was never likely to attend, not least as he wasn't going to allow it to look as if he had been manipulated and dared by Zelensky. Sometimes it can help break a logjam, think Reagan and Gorbachev, but leaders usually turn up to seal the deal at the end of the process after experts have done all the hard preparatory work away from the cameras. Right, Reagan and Gorbachev negotiating on the nuclear arms kind of treaties and that sort of thing, they actually got to know each other and got to work things out. I don't think that's going to work out here. Do we honestly think two men who so plainly loathe each other and who have been shamelessly posturing for Trump's benefit were going to reach some kind of meeting of minds? Possible, but unlikely. No, we don't think that. But the trick was that Zelensky was saying, I'm coming, I'm all in for peace, and Putin wasn't actually going to be all in for peace. Medinsky led the talks in 2022 that failed to reach a usable deal. We can discount the myth that Zelensky was about to agree to Russia's demands until Boris Johnson nixed it. So this meant to signal continuity in the process and demand. Okay, and continuity in the demand. When you owned even more of the country by force, you're going back to that same demand, even though you control less of it right now. Okay. Medinsky's very lack of personal authority isn't a snub. I think it's kind of a snub, but he says it's not a snub so much as a sign that Putin wants to manage any process by remote control. I think that's right. He's using these guys as kind of drones so that he can manage the process and it can't get out of hand, and he can just kind of say, nope, they don't have the authority to do that. He is a human drone, which at least means any positions he advances or agrees already have Vladimir Putin's okay. Right. So we know that much. And he can't advance anything other than that. The rest of the delegation, likewise, isn't showy, though the presence of military intel chief is interesting as they were key in POW swaps, but likewise meant to signal a willingness to do serious work. Although it doesn't necessarily mean that they'll make any compromises. Of course, with no hint that Russia is about to relax its implausible and unfair demands, this may all be for show. It is all for show. It probably is, but talking is always good as long as there's a chance, however minuscule, that talks can lead somewhere. So although Medinsky is a shallow ideologist and sending him is, in a way, a snub, a means for Putin to try to reject Zelensky's challenge while not looking wholly uncooperative in Trump's eyes. Remember, that's what they're going for here. Whereas before I was 99% pessimistic about the talks, now I'm only 98%. So that is as much room for optimism as there is these days. Okay, so yeah, this was never going to go anywhere. And somebody who writes about Russia regularly is saying I'm 98% pessimistic. Now, who are these guys? So let's look at this. This is the Wall Street Journal. Putin's decision to send lower level officials instead of attending himself has eliminated any chance of a breakthrough, according to Western diplomats, that by appointing a former culture minister, Medinsky, in the photo here, as head of the Russian delegation, Putin made it clear that he is not willing to compromise and is still pursuing the same goals as in 2022. That is the elimination of Ukraine as a sovereign state capable of defending itself. Now, who are the other guys here? Kostyuskov oversaw numerous GRUT operations in Europe, including several failed assassinations of Zelensky in Kyiv in 2022. Okay, how about that? And then there's the other guy, Fomin. Okay, so as expected, Putin is sending Turkey a delegation led by Medinsky and Fomin in the same team that was sent to negotiate a Ukrainian surrender in 2022. Here's an excerpt from my book, Our Enemies Will Vanish, that describes how it went back then. Let me read this. The Russians expected full Ukrainian surrender in Gomel. The chief Russian representative, former culture minister Vladimir Medinsky, recited a long list of demands. It included Ukrainian troops handing over all their tanks and artillery to Russian forces and cutting down the Ukrainian army to some 50,000 men armed with only rifles and pistols. Moscow wanted different Russian-friendly government installed in Kyiv. And that was really the whole point of this whole war. The Russians wanted to control Ukraine, and they wanted to just change the leadership and then control Ukraine like the way they had for years before. Okay, Moscow wanted a Russian-friendly government installed in Kyiv, the arrest and trial of Nazis, the restoration of Russian as Ukraine's official language, and Russian control over Ukraine's foreign policy. Medinsky even demanded that the streets named after Ukrainian national heroes hostile to Russia be returned to their old Soviet names. A less polished member of the Russian delegation, Deputy Defense Minister Colonel General Alexander Fomin, told the Ukrainians in blunt terms what would happen if they refused. Quote, "We will keep killing and slaughtering you," unquote, he said, according to one of the Ukrainian negotiators. Zelensky's advisor, Mikhailo Podolyak, said, quote, we listened to them and we realized that these are not people sent for talks, but for our capitulation," unquote. Podolyak recalled. They had no understanding of the country they had invaded and of our resources. They had no idea how to negotiate. The Ukrainians, he added, agreed to the meeting so that they could try to understand Russia's true intentions and push for humanitarian ceasefires and brief truces that would gain Kyiv time. Okay, so that's the cast of characters that we're looking at here. It's really interesting who these guys are. Last little bit by Darth Putin. I have rejected my own proposal for peace talks without preconditions, proving Ukraine wants war. Okay, my friends, that's all that I have for you today. Thank you for your time, the likes, the shares, and the subscribes, and thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.